Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Charlton. I'm Associate Director of Public Engagement for De Montfort University, and also I lead on our United Nations Academic Impact Hub for Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is peace, justice and strong institutions. And today we have a special seminar with some of our best researchers to really emphasize the great work that our university does around the issue of SDG16, because today is the International Day of Peace from the United Nations. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how the day is going to go, and hopefully we're all using new technology today, so we're a little bit nervous, but we're going to go through and hear from some great researchers. Then there's the opportunity, then there's a panel discussion, then there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. Now, if you think of questions throughout the discussion, then please drop them in the chat, and then we'll bring you into the conversation down the when we get to the question and answer session. So I'm going to hopefully try and get my slides up now and start to talk about Sustainable Development Goal 16. So, excuse me. And when I had a rehearsal, I was able to move these on, and all of a sudden I can't do that. So that's not so great. But yeah. So I think, well, this is embarrassing, isn't it? But, let me have a look at my, okay. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Like I said, it's new technology, and I'm just getting to grips to it right now. So we've got an excellent lineup today. Well, 2 out of the 3 ain't bad, as they say. So I'm going to talk about the work the university has done in its role as an SDG16 hub during the pandemic. And then I'm going to hand over to Dr. Victoria Knight, who is going to discuss revisiting the digital prison in light of social distancing. And then I'll hand over to Dr. James Tangen, who will discuss digital rights and the digital divide, which for those of you who have been following the university's response to the pandemic closely, this is an issue that's come up significantly again and again. So I think there's some really valid things, and I hope this is of interest to everyone. So this is how the day will run. I'm doing the welcome now. So welcome, everybody. I do want to say we're very proud to be United Nations Academic Hub for SDG 16. And we have 2 great researchers on today in Victoria and James, but the university itself has some absolutely brilliant colleagues who have done some fascinating research around the issue of SDG 16. So when we've heard from Victoria and James, there'll be a discussion about their work, and then there's the opportunity for you to answer questions. And I'll emphasize again, if you can drop your questions into the chat on the right hand side, and we'll collate them and we'll bring that into the discussion at the end. So from my perspective, I lead the United Nations Academic Impact Hub at DMU, and there are 17 hubs around the world, and we're the only one in the United Kingdom, so that's something that makes DMU very proud, and it also gives us a global focus to the work that we do. So we connect with the other 16 impact hubs, and we share the work that we're doing, and we also are in receipt of the work that they do in terms of collaboration and trying to develop research and teaching resources around the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll discuss a little bit more about SDG 16, then I'll move on to how we've responded to the COVID-19 pandemic in Leicester as a university and what our response has been and our research. And then I also want to encourage people to try to participate in the work of the UNI Hub at DMU if you can, and see the opportunities that it offers staff, students and members of the public. So to talk about SDG 16, it's known widely as the Great Enabler. And initially when DMU became the hub for SDG 16, and it was presented as a project to be delivered, I was quite nervous because it seemed, if you look at the other SDGs, so no poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality education, they're quite self-explanatory in their aims. So when we were given SDG 16, it was an immediate challenge to try to understand it. And I had a personal concern that it was going to be a very difficult concept to understand. And I was jealous of some of the other universities around the world who had the perhaps more straightforward SDGs to champion. But since I've been working with SDG 16, I absolutely think we've got the best and most interesting SDG of them all. And I know you might say, well, I would say that, but if you put it in context that the people currently working on no poverty, they cannot achieve their goal unless their country is at peace, or their country is anti-corruption, or their country has a good rule of law, a strong democracy. And if you apply that measure to every other SDG, it really puts SDG 16 as a pivotal SDG that cannot, which allows the other SDGs to be achieved. So if we're successful in driving home SDG 16 in this decade of action between now and 2030, we will support all the other SDGs in their aims. And that's a really a magnificent opportunity, and gives us such diversity in our work to achieve these goals. That's why SDG 16 is known as the Great Enabler. So there are some very strong impacts and targets within SDG 16. I'm sure when people look at SDG 16 from the face of it, and perhaps from the symbol that demonstrates SDG 16 in the chart, it looks like it's a very light, peace is a good thing, who could argue with that? But if you actually drill down into the targets and indicators, it's perhaps not about peace at all, but it's about violence, corruption, war, and how we protect our societies against these situations, rather than trying to deliver peace en masse. It's perhaps working towards reducing these instances of corruption and war, and having benign dictatorships and things like that. So I would recommend to anyone who is not familiar with SDG 16, don't take it on face value of the cover of the emblem, but to actually just have a look at the indicators. And then perhaps if you're a student or member of staff at the university, consider how some of those targets and indicators actually apply to your work, because it's quite there are lots of opportunities to steer your work towards hitting some of the SDG 16 targets and indicators. And obviously, if you do steer your work in that direction, please do get in touch, and we can talk about potential collaborations on that. So my presentation today really is about how we've delivered Sustainable Development Goals 16, peace, justice and strong institutions, during a pandemic. And it's quite an interesting story, and we're on what has begun to be quite a long journey, which is obviously concurrent with the cycle of the pandemic, which we're acutely aware some economists say that we won't see the end of the impacts of the pandemic until for up to 7 years, in terms of economic impacts and impacts on communities and so on. So we, as a UN hub, we followed the United Nations call to create any response to enable our communities to build back better and leave no one behind. So that these are interesting terms, because they kind of acknowledge that things weren't perfect in our communities, even here in Leicester, and this is a global call, but it's absolutely applicable to Leicester, that you could build back better, because we acknowledge that things weren't perfect before, and we'll leave no one behind, because we are aware that some communities have been left behind in the past, and we need to bring them along. So the university, and at the time of the lockdown, when things got really serious in Leicester, we developed a humanitarian and strategic response. The humanitarian response was led by DMU Local, and the photo you can see on the screen is members of the DMU Local team acting as volunteers for E2 in Beaumont Leys, and they were distributing hundreds of food parcels a day to vulnerable people who were shielding or isolating at that time. And how this connects with SDG 16, as I said, if you drill into the targets, you'll see many interesting things, and this one is SDG 16.7, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory and representative decision makings at all levels. And we took that target to consider how we would build a long-term strategic response to the pandemic. So what we did was we developed a project called the DMU Community Solutions Programme, and this really put situated the programme of activity that we were going to create with our communities and build projects together, which were delivered from grassroots, and also engaged lots of people in decision making on how we should best deliver a response to the pandemic. And we had a huge consultation to develop this programme, which involved 60 DMU researchers, the Leicester City Council, the local NHS and the Department of Work and Pensions and other authorities, 80 community organisations ranging from small scale organisations that delivered food banks in their local estates to national organisations who are delivering all kinds of work hugely recognisable to everyone. And also we used our local media to do a huge call out to allow the general public to get involved, and they bombarded the DMU Local email with lots of different ideas about what they felt were the priorities to build back better in Leicester, and also the business community. And we are due to do a similar exercise with returning De Montfort University students. So we're making sure that all voices are heard in our programme. So having undertaken that huge exercise, we established the programme in partnership with Leicester City Council and their members on the Local Resilience Forum. And this was to enable us to provide some strong policy recommendations to the Mayor's office in Leicester, and also enabled us to work with the community groups that were calling for those policy recommendations to actually collaborate with either the university, other community groups, the city council, or and just work through some of the ideas and interventions that had been suggested. We're currently in the situation of forming working groups to create new projects to begin the journey of building back better, and there's been lots of interest in very specific areas, and some of which are going to be talked about today, particularly around digital divide. There's the opportunity here for interventions to be developed which utilise our researchers' expertise and co-create novel ideas with frontline community groups. So these ideas have been kind of suggested by either our best researchers or by community groups, and there's been some middle ground that's been found between the two, and new projects are being stimulated from that. So it's quite an exciting time, and the formation of the working groups that I mentioned will start to take these forward in the near future. So I mentioned earlier that we have both a humanitarian response and strategic response. So the strategic response that I've just mentioned is really positioning DMU at the forefront of the long-term pandemic response, and I'm very grateful to the 70 members of De Montfort University staff who have joined me on that journey. And this opportunity is still open to all staff and students. So please do get in touch if you want to be part of the Community Solutions Programme. But I did want to mention especially that the public engagement team at De Montfort University, as part of their humanitarian response, actually built a protective equipment distribution centre in a building that was provided by DMU Sport, and they took over the watershed, which is quite a large gymnasium by the River Soar, and they created a distribution centre which enabled them to provide the local NHS and care homes and other charity organisations with thousands of pieces of protective equipment during the pandemic. And the photo you see on the right hand side is the day one of the distribution centre. So it was quite a vast space with DMU staff and volunteers working together to get the kit out to the people who needed it most. So we're very proud of the response that we've done so far, but we're acutely aware that this is a long journey for us. But I really did want to mention that the DMU local team, led by the head of public engagement, Fee Donovan, and Jess Bojic of DMU local, and enabled this magnificent response to the immediate impacts of the crisis. And that really did add strength to our elbow as a sustainable development goal for SDG 16, because in times of a pandemic, we were able to demonstrate ourselves as a strong anchor institution for our city, and we supported our city through what was an incredibly difficult time. So I hope you've learned something about the work that we're currently undertaking and have undertaken at De Montfort University as part of our role of SDG 16 Hub. It's the start of a new academic year, and we really want to get more people involved in the work of the Hub. And you can do that by following us on social media, or you can do that by emailing me and requesting to get involved in the projects. We have a huge consultation document which outlines the opportunity for people to get involved in working groups, and if you email me, I can send you a copy of that document, and you can perhaps decide if you want to get involved in the specific areas, the 30 policy areas that we're hoping to develop interventions from to enable Leicester and Leicestershire to build back better from the pandemic. So thank you very much for listening. It's my responsibility now to invite Dr. Victoria. My mind's gone blank, Vic. Sorry, but it's yeah. So it's my pleasure to invite. Excuse me, Dr. Victoria Knight to talk about revisiting the digital prison in light of social distancing. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Mark. We're having trouble with names this morning, aren't we? Okay. I'm just waiting for my slides to appear. I've got a couple of visuals that I'd like to show you guys as I progress through this. As Mark says, I'm Dr. Victoria Knight. I belong to the Community and Criminal Justice Division at Montfort University in Health and Life Sciences. I'm the director of our Prisons and Probation Research Hub, and I've been undertaking research in prisons for, showing my age now, about 20 years. The focus of today's discussion is around what I'm calling the digital prison and the digitisation of our prisons. And I'm going to walk you through some of that. And in light of COVID, I think what I'm going to present to you is some interesting food for thought. But before I get going with the presentation, I would like to give credit to some other people, because without their inputs in my journey of researching and exploring this concept of the digital prison, you know, I couldn't have done it without them. I've put a reference list at the end of my slides, and you'll see these names appear in there. But Stephen van der Steen from Belgium, now France, Dr. Lee Hadlington, Bianca Reisdorf and Jason Morris have all been influential in, I suppose, my own scholarship, but our collaborative scholarship in relation to the digital prison. And I've been really, really lucky to work with them. My research is international in shape, and I'm going to kind of talk from a position of the UK, but I'm going to throw in some international examples as well. The current global pandemic presents new challenges and serious risks for our prisons. And I suppose our collective compliance with social distancing measures has turned many of us towards an increased reliance on technology to undertake many routine tasks, as we are doing today, and explore new ways to connect with our families, friends, at work, in leisure even, and education. I've never trained so hard. I've done so many online exercise classes. I've never been as fit. Whilst this has been enlightening, it's also, I think, shone a light on those unable to participate in the digital world. And James Tangen later is going to kind of, I'm hoping, amplify my point here, and to connect with our communities. You know, we've seen over the past few months, news feeds are littered with examples of communities deploying technology to assist in the fight against COVID and ensuring people are cared for, protected, kept informed, for example. However, it's sad to say, but including those people in prison remain more disconnected from civic society than ever before. And yet these people are still part of our communities, and in a sense that's then heightening social health and economic inequalities. If I can go to the next slide, please, that would be really helpful. Now, these are my two favourite quotes. What I'm trying to say here, in sum, is that we have moved towards being online to the fact that our life is now on life. And I like that quote, that kind of labours, I suppose, the normality of technology and the interface that it has with so many of us in our everyday lives. And obviously one of my favourite scholars, Merowitz, I've overused this quote, but technology is not neutral. It has an impact on human behaviour, on how we organise our societies, how we interact with each other. And I just wanted to kind of labour that point, that the digital world is now becoming more and more familiar, in fact, normal. So moving to the next slide then, in the context of the prison, I think this is a great image that I want to convey to listeners and viewers today. This is a drawing of our Victorian prisons here in the UK, and this demonstrates something that they used to call the separate and silent system. And if you do take a closer look there, what you can see is that this is the prison chapel, by the way, and you can see the prisoners there sat on the church pews, but the pews between the people are divided. So the ethos was that the prison ethos was that people needed to be separated. And what I want to propose then is, what's new? How, and I've said elsewhere that, our prisons are still communication poor environments. And I think this is a great metaphor to kind of look at our prisons as these very depriving environments. So moving to the next slide then. Locking down sites of lockdown. As we all saw, COVID impacted acutely on all closed and regulated environments. We were all sent home. Our schools closed. To some extent, our hospitals and doctors' surgeries, for example, closed down. We were only allowed to travel for essential purposes, or if we were key workers. And in the context of our prisons, these social practices of social distancing were also implemented to our prisons. So certainly in England and Wales, that basically the rules of social distancing were applied to our prisons as well as communities. Now, based on that image that I've just shown you of the Victorian prison, in a sense, that's a metaphor for what happened to our prisons during lockdown. Basically, prisoners were put behind their doors. And what this means is then, fundamentally, there was more lockup time behind cell doors. And what happened to prisoners is that they were very carefully supervised to carry out basic things like shower and make a telephone call home. Work, unless essential, again, so they had key workers in prisons, had stopped. Education had halted, for example. Leisure time ceased. Visits with family and friends were stopped altogether. So prisoners spend most of the time anyway without social distancing behind their cell doors. And at best, prison services can only provide, certain things within the cell. So my earlier work, for example, on in-cell television discusses, I suppose, the sort of benefits or the therapeutic benefits and challenges of this kind of intervention. In the dark shadow of COVID-19, in-cell television then in itself became increasingly a measure of pacification, comfort, control and companionship for these men and women behind their cell doors during lockdown. Likewise, many households have turned in just the same way since social isolation measures were imposed upon us. And I think, unlike prisoners, some of us still had the opportunity to work, to volunteer, to be with our families, to exploit community activities online, for example. An adaptation for us back out in the community to life behind our doors has, for some, been smoothed by digital engagement. Sadly, our prisons in the main are communication poor environments, and availability of technology for prisons is limited. If I move to the next slide, the point that I want to make here is that as a result of social distancing, this pain of being in prison, which is as a result of a whole heap of deprivations, was amplified. And I don't want to undermine the pains of imprisonment here or the hardship of global lockdown, or that are, you know, but in many senses, we have experienced what it's like to be a prisoner. And degrees of deprivation you know, are very vivid. If any of you have been into a prison or have visited a prison or know people that have either worked or done time, you will hear about these deprivations that prison, you know, this is established knowledge. So the lack of social contact brings about isolation, it brings about loneliness, it brings about boredom and hopelessness. The fact that you can't access goods and services in prison means that you can't take control of your life. So basically, you're behind your cell door with, in some cases, another prisoner and maybe the television set or the radio, and that is it. In some, then, this amplified pain has been no good for our prisons during lockdown, and it makes running them hard and challenging and fraught with conflict. So on to the next slide then. What I've been witnessing in the last six years or so, the research that I've been doing, is this concept of the digital prison, the digitization of the prison landscape, where prisoners can access goods and services and support through digital means. But what I've witnessed is that many prison services have been tentative and cautious about this digital transformation, in fear that, you know, prisoners are receiving luxury items and they're worried about public opinion. But what I have seen across the globe is small rafts of digital services being provided by prisoners. Outside and in cell facilities. Now what we're seeing in some countries, and 2 prisons in this country, there's a small image there of access to, you know, laptops and digital platforms for prisoners to order meals, to book their visits, to apply for jobs, etc. Since COVID, I have been inundated with a flurry of requests about digitizing the prison. And I think what COVID has done is shone a light on the fact that, you know, if we continue depriving prisons of access even to the basic telephone, there's going to be serious problems. So what COVID has done, in a sense, it's taken this digital deprivation seriously. So I've witnessed a shift in acceptability and wanting to push it forward. For example, video calls have been introduced in some prisons in this country. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a postcode lottery, and we've seen the uptake across the globe. There's been an increased use in telephone, for example, and video calls to complete things like parole hearings, court hearings, etc., etc. So I think it's an interesting time, and there's sort of silver linings here with respect to the COVID crisis, that actually this shift toward the digitization of the prison landscape is gaining momentum. However, and this is my last and final slide. Next slide, please. I've been doing a lot of work, and as you can imagine, one of the great scholars that's influenced a lot of my thinking is Professor Mike Nellis, who's warned that the technologicalization, if that's a word, the digitization of the criminal justice system can actually make that landscape even more punitive. So in the work that I'm doing, that I've kind of applauded the benefits of, you know, opportunities that digitization can rehabilitate and even trigger, you know, those desistant journeys. To what extent can digitization make those landscapes even more punitive, even more controlling, even more surveillance, and even more depriving? So I've been working with Stephen van der Steen on what we're calling that sort of ethical digital innovation, and that are we wanting to disrupt the punitive regime in replace for a desistance regime or a desistance focused regime? And there are a number of moral drivers when we're thinking about technology, about human rights. What rights do prisoners have to things like privacy? What are their legal rights, for example? The fact that digitization brings about digital literacy and makes life more normal for that transition back into the community. We know as well that it's harmful to deprive. So if we're depriving people of access to technologies, it may deplete that digital literacy. So when they come to apply for a job, when they're released, that they've lost those skills. But also the therapeutic and restorative elements to digitization. So what we've been doing is developing an ethical framework or a set of principles around, you know, the fact that, you know, there is an inevitability that our prisons will become digitized. That's not going to go away, and that will happen. So what are the, you know, that there are legal principles, there's stuff around privacy and what we know about GDPR and how does that relate to people in prison. Do they have the same rights, for example? What about equality and fairness and meeting the needs of different sorts of prisoners, that they're not an homogenous group? Stuff around proportionality. To what extent can we use technology? Should we be introducing artificial intelligence, for example? You know, can we rely on computers to make decisions about parole, what sentences they're getting? So all these are of concern to me. But I think what I've been doing is a lot of work and rejecting this idea of technology bringing about a more ultra punitive regime, but a more ultra rehabilitative regime as well. I'd like to thank everybody for this opportunity. Hello again. And on the slides there, I don't know if we can make this available, but please do get in contact with me if you want to. Oh, there we go. There's some further reading on there, and I give credit to all the other people that I've mentioned there, and some of the stuff that we are doing. It's very exciting times with respect to that, and I suppose in keeping with the SDG in terms of peace, justice, and strong institutions, that I think my message today is that we need to do that in a responsible way and be as ethical as we can be. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hello again, everyone. Just while James gets his slides together, I'd like to thank Victoria for her really excellent presentation, and also to say this is the points raised that connect with Sustainable Development Goal 16 in Target and Indicator 16.3, which I know you all know is to promote the rule of law and ensure equal access to justice. And this is important actually, because if countries can't provide and institutions can't provide that level of access to justice, then the issue of poor prison conditions shows systemic deficiencies within the wider legal system. So this is a really important part of Sustainable Development Goal 16. So thank you again, Victoria, and hopefully I've killed time enough for James to now come on and give his presentation. So I'd like to introduce Dr. James Tangen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks, Victoria, as well. A lot of the issues that Victoria's just talked about are things that are very close to my heart. What I'm going to do is take a slightly broader view, though. So my aim here is really to provide a brief analysis of the way digital technologies are influencing attempts to build peace internationally, and to address some of the social frictions that we've been witnessing that have kind of come to the fore during the lockdown due to COVID-19. Similar to Vic, I also want to give credit where it's due, and also to use this platform to sort of point people to some other resources that are available that you can go and explore, and hopefully take a look at what you can do as well to get involved in this peace building process. So the framework that I'm looking at is going to take a look at examples of digital peace building after a fully fledged civil war, peace building in the context of electoral violence, digital technologies as part of a national dialogue process following a popular uprising or protest, and also looking at the sort of social negotiations at the end of an armed insurgency, or follow in the immediate aftermath of a trigger event that might be involved in a terrorist attack or something similar. It's not possible for me to go into all of the nuances of this framework, but I do want to highlight that the project that actually developed this framework is called the Digital Peacemaking Project. So you can find them at digitalpeacemaking.com. And they have a fantastic breakdown of their framework and some really interesting examples from their work as well. So that it gives much more detail about the different phases that are involved in this framework. So the first point that I really want to raise is that the ease of access to high quality digital technologies, both in terms of their sort of general availability, their ubiquity, and the relative affordability compared with traditional media technologies, kind of challenges the boundaries of traditional fact production. It involves members of the public acting as citizen journalists, for example. So it allows us to explore current affairs stories from a very different perspective. No longer is it someone being, on occasion, literally parachuted into a war zone. You're getting stories from the bottom up, from people who are producing narratives about their own lived experiences of that conflict. And the relationship of these narratives to the conflicts in which citizen journalists are reporting is both imminent and immediate. So it's imminent in the sense that the narratives are constructed about and from within the conflicts to which they relate, but they're also immediate in the sense that the initial coverage doesn't have any delay. It no longer requires the marshalling of quite a large logistics exercise to try and deploy journalists to a particular area, even when those journalists are in the country where the conflict is taking place already. Notoriously, there's been several instances where there's been flare-ups in violence, and it's very difficult to get to those locations because one of the first things that seems to happen is infrastructure, transportation, the distribution of logistics all get cut off when armed conflict emerges, and we see that in over a number of years in places like Syria, Libya, and also in Europe, in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the breakup of the former Yugoslav Republic. One of the things that you also get is, as long as you've got sufficient infrastructure, you can avoid editorializing the narrative, so that citizen journalists are presenting what they want to talk about. And with relatively simple software, longer forms of journalism also become possible. And it would be a serious error of judgment to underestimate the quality of that work. So the images that you can see on screen are of Wad Al-Khatib, a citizen journalist who worked with both Channel 4 and the BBC, who ultimately went on to produce and direct the long-form documentary for Sama. And you can see Wad and Sama in the image on the left on your screen. You can also see the poster for the cinematic release of For Sama, which went on to win multiple awards. It was Oscar nominated. It also won the Lion d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, and also won the BAFTA for Best Documentary. And this was released only in 2019, so this is a very current documentary about the war in Syria and the experiences of raising a child in a war zone. An interesting project that then explores this longer form journalism is the Conflict Reportage Project, which is hosted by the Documentary Media Centre in Leicester. So John Costa, who's the founder of the Documentary Media Centre, has drawn together experts from a whole range of fields who are knowledgeable about several key conflicts over the last 100 years, who then examine the various documentary media forms for reporting conflicts from the First World War to the present day, as well as considering the changing nature of conflict reporting, including the role of digital technology in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. John's work also has a simultaneous digital aspect in that a large proportion of what he does, as well as having a physical site, is actually delivered online as well. And he's broadcast some very interesting sort of 24-hour events over the lockdown period, hoping to engage with a whole variety of different audiences where people might have specific interests in how conflicts are reported. But it's not just about reporting on things that have happened, it's also about raising awareness about things that are ongoing at the moment. And also developing calls for policy action, making sure that people can try and change their social circumstances, change the way that society functions by calling on the government to change their policies. Data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which is based in the US, has actually explored and produced data about the number of protests that have been taking place during the lockdown. So there's a particularly high number of protest events between June and August 2020 that coincided with the spread of COVID-19 across the US. And we're quite familiar from the news at the moment that this relates to the numerous examples of racial profiling and police violence against Black, Indigenous and people of color in the US, which were circulated and recirculated through social media platforms, and it's prompted civil unrest and attempts to use digital media to coordinate offline action. For example, the creation of autonomous zones in some US cities. This is not a power grab, as one anarchist YouTuber from Tulsa told the BBC. The direction many people are going in is towards organizing neighborhoods, democratic structures that allow people to make decisions together and to create an autonomous zone by building citizen power first and then declaring autonomy, instead of seizing an autonomous zone in a spontaneous movement and then having to work through the chaos. So digital technologies play a role in mobilizing specific groups within the population to take direct action, and also facilitate the organizing of these actions in the offline world. And it's been a rising phenomenon since the high-profile use of social media to coordinate the Arab Spring back in 2011. During the current global pandemic, however, such large gatherings present a potential public health risk, particularly when the emotional influence of protests means that social distancing measures are sometimes ignored. Consequently, infectious disease researchers have suggested expressing solidarity through digital pathways, such as protesting online or donating to groups working around issues that cause social friction. And this is where I have to sort of add the caveat that digital technologies are not a panacea. Historically, the type of collectivism or the kind of activism that I've just described has been accused of being no more than collectivism. It's been criticized as being superficial and too easy to ignore. One quite notorious example is Julian Lewis, who's the MP for New Forest East, who's required his constituents to write to him offline through snail mail rather than answering emails anymore. And this is partly due to the rise of online campaigning sites such as change.org, which allowed his constituents and people from outside his constituency to contact him quickly and effectively. And he claimed that his inbox was so overcrowded it wasn't possible to identify constituency work. However, it's the only time I can think of someone requiring a citizen, someone to contact someone using a handwritten letter or an offline letter, other than serving prisoners. And this goes back to some of the comments that Vic was making a moment ago. And even there have been, as Vic highlighted, developments with communication technologies to allow different forms of email to be used within a prison. And here we have a serving MP who refuses to engage in the digital. So digital technologies aren't a panacea, and successful social action and political campaigning still requires a blended approach, adopting the platform that's the most effective in getting your message across to your target audience. One of the most remarkable examples of a grassroots campaign during the COVID lockdown in the UK has been driven by the footballer Marcus Rashford, who's utilised a clever blend of broadcast, print and social media to leverage the government to reverse its decision to end the food voucher scheme targeted at supporting people on universal credits. Although Rashford has utilised the Twitter platform to garner public support for the cause, the mainstream media has also been drawn in through his tweets for his comments in some of their reporting. It's not also been the primary focus of his work. Rather, he's worked in partnership with fairshare.org to develop the practical impact around which the rest of the popular campaign has centred. So he's built an impact and then is using social media to highlight that. He's also utilised the very traditional approach of an open letter in the Times newspaper to apply further pressure on the government, adapting his approach to a medium through which public campaigners have addressed governments for decades. Digital technologies should not only be thought of as information and communications technologies that exist only as software applications. Since 1996, Brazil's used digital ballot boxes across their local and national elections. Utilising a numeric keypad laid out like a phone and images of the candidates, it's believed that their system is secure, reliable, and supports a broader range of the population being able to vote, as issues of literacy have been removed. However, it's also true that digital technologies have the potential to provide information in an easily digested format. And it's now common practice for campaign materials to be delivered either digitally first or digital only. A prime example of this was the move to elected police and crime commissioners in 2011, when no funding was made available to candidates for their traditional mail shot approach to getting their message across. And so candidates were required or forced to adopt a digital approach. The limitations of some platforms, however, do not lend themselves to nuanced debate, a point that can be difficult for freshman candidates attempting to shift the narrative surrounding a political party. And for anyone who's interested in that, it's worth taking a look at the number of statements that Rosie Sexton had to do during her insurgent candidacy for the leadership of the Green Party over the summer. Rosie repeatedly required to clarify a position on key points that have been presented through the Twitter platform. And the short form of that particular social media platform really doesn't lend itself to nuanced debate. The potential damage to the legitimacy of voting systems that underpins liberal democratic notions of democracy is so severe that transnational social media platforms have begun to flag posts that attempt to destabilise the electorate's ability to make informed decisions at the ballot box. Most notably, during the current pandemic, Twitter's begun to sanction President Donald Trump and his tweeting about the risks of electoral fraud through the postal voting system, with Twitter attaching a message stating that they violate the platform's rules on civic and electoral integrity. Such claims about the integrity of voting systems that derogate from traditional in-person approaches risk eroding public trust in both postal voting and as an existing technological adaptation to voting, and also the willingness of the electorate to accept further technological innovations that could be applied at the ballot box, such as the broader adoption of digital ballot boxes or even online voting. So digitalization of elections requires confidence about the security of any technological innovations. But Donald Trump's actions also help identify the need for governments to respect the rule of law, both internationally and domestically, if digital technology is to be adopted. And this has been considered beyond just the United States. So consideration of the digitalization of the voting system in Bosnia and Herzegovina has been criticized as a superficial reform without the commitment of the state to respect and enforce judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. On 3 separate occasions, the European Court has identified that the existing electoral system in Bosnia and Herzegovina favours members of the constituent nations at the expense of the democratic rights of ethnic minority groups within its borders. One of the other areas that digital technology can come in terms of addressing social friction and the concerns that people have within society are around responding to crises, and particularly around the aftermath of armed insurgencies or terrorist acts. The safety function from Facebook, which was one of the first platforms to adopt this real-time reporting of information about the safety of users to their broader network, was introduced in 2014, in October 2014. And initially, it's a response to natural disasters. Its first use was actually in April of 2015 with the Nepal earthquake. But very rapidly, by November 2015, it was being deployed for terrorist events. Initially with the Paris attacks, but also with bombings in Nigeria by Boko Haram. And the following year in 2016, there were, I believe, more deployments of the safety check function due to armed insurgency than there were due to natural disasters. There were bombings where the function was activated in Ankara, Turkey, Brussels in Belgium, Lahore, Pakistan, Orlando, Florida in the US, and the following year it was also brought in for the London Bridge attack as well. Research conducted in 2018 by members of the Global Peace and Transitional Justice Research Group here at DMU identified that following a trigger event, there's actually a spike in hate incidents, which normally occurs between 24 and 48 hours in the digital environment, and then moves to the offline environment between 48 and 72 hours post the trigger event. We found that the prevalence and severity of the hate incidents are influenced by government, media, and police responses to the trigger event. So it's important that, for example, in the wake of the London Bridge attack or the bombing of Manchester Arena, that Muslim communities were given a platform to express their emotions in response to the trigger events, because that helped to manage some of the hate incidents that occurred afterwards. Government and political parties are also inherently integrally involved in these responses, and they need to provide clear leadership and a distinctive counter-narrative to the kind of anti-Muslim sentiments that we found were being expressed in the wake of attacks that had been described as Islamist-inspired. While the police should be implementing the national 14-day plan in the aftermath of a potential trigger event to help manage media reporting, we found that that's only really been effectively and fully implemented following the Westminster Bridge attack. But that did have a noticeable impact on the intensity and frequency of hate incidents following that incident. Reporting needs to be balanced, and media outlets should be held to account for reporting that is inflammatory and factually inaccurate. There are standards of journalism that need to be maintained, and the emotion that is running through society shouldn't be amplified through media reporting. Social media also has a platform, as platforms also have a role to play, and they really should be enforcing zero tolerance towards posts that incite hate. So we've got a lot of opportunities within the digital technology to provide a more even playing field for people who are divided from those in power. It should be noted that the opportunities for them to create influence is still mediated by those in power, and those people who hold power, the media and the government and the police, need to be exercising that power responsibly and effectively. If you're interested in the work of the research group, then follow us on Twitter. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much. So I'll come back.
Thank you very much, James. And for those of you who are really into the SDG targets, this speaks a lot to DG16 target number 10, which is the right to press freedom and information. And thank you for that. I should say, please do put questions in the comment section for both Victoria and for James, or even myself, as we will come to the Q&A in about 10 minutes after a panel discussion between myself, James, and Victoria, who is thankfully back online and now unmuted and unleashed. So thank you both, really. I think fantastic pieces of work that you've both done, and absolutely fascinating. I thought there was something in Victoria's presentation that I thought is a good starter of a conversation, which was the quote you used, which was, I noticed, was from 1985, and it was "Technology is not neutral." And I think we're learning that very much this year, but somebody spotted that a long time ago. And I just want to throw out, and maybe if we look at that bold statement, then what is the risk of technology not being neutral at this time in the context of your research, Victoria?
I think what I find stimulating about what Merowitz was saying was that, you know, we pay little attention to the hard and software that is in our lives. And my starting point as a researcher was looking at the use of television in prisons, that this inanimate object kind of changed much about the ways in which that prison or a prison is run. So throughout that study, I kind of explored previous research around use of television in domestic settings in the home. And it's not just a piece of equipment that delivers information, that we socially organize ourselves around. You know, we've reinvented our homes because of television, where we play our sofa, when we eat our meals, when we do our ironing, you know. I'm thinking about traditional sort of broadcast television and how families came together and or separated. The conflicts that happened in our living rooms because Dad wanted to watch X and Mum wanted to watch Y. So I think what Merowitz was talking about was the social impact of technology in our everyday lives, and that it would be foolish of us to say that it can't be neutral, because it does create sets of behaviours and responses, and organisations shape themselves around forms of technology, be it the family, be it the prison, in my case, the workplace, for example. And so what I'm deeply fascinated with is the relationships that we have with our technology, and how we manufacture our daily lives with it. We resist it, we accept it, we can't live without it. There's a lot of work being done on addiction to media, or certainly, you know, particularly around young people and the fear that they're addicted to gaming. And there's lots and lots of divided opinion about that. But that in itself, for me, is an interesting proposition that, and I think that links to that other quote about us moving from being online, that it's just something that services us. So, you know, a very narrow way of thinking about the television set is it just delivers information. It's more than that. It's a comfort blanket. It's companionship. It challenges us. We can travel without moving, for example, you know, and Roger Silverstone, who's done some really interesting work on the television in the home, you know, we can go to children can go to the Sahara Desert and be there on screen before they've even crossed the road by themselves. So, and I think relating to what James was talking about connecting with our communities, or the disconnect between communities because of mediated outlets, presents, I think, for us as humans, different challenges. And certainly in terms of my research, what kind of impact is that having on the prison environment? They introduced televisions, and that was very much wrapped into prison policy, about compliance, about behavioural management, about control, about, you know, therapeutic interventions. And so that innocent piece of kit is very, very powerful. And that's what I'm deeply fascinated with.
James, I know you've got a few comments to make on the same subject, I think.
Yeah, it particularly Vic's point about the way that introducing the television, particularly sort of from the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, changes the layout of the house. Once you move into sort of satellite and cable delivery, and you get these subscription services, what was it? Probably the late 90s when they started having multiple users, and suddenly the relationships in the house are completely fractured.
Yeah.
You end up with children who live almost their entire lives in their bedroom because they're able to access all the media they want, and they don't have to interact with their parents. I use this in my teaching, and it's a little bit glib, but it is very true. Most of my relationship with my own mother is actually conducted through Facebook at the moment, because it's a lot easier to just post something and have a conversation without having to visit and then risk all of the issues around COVID. But equally, my partner and I have made a very deliberate decision not to follow each other on social media as well. So that my work, which is a lot of what I do on social media is related to my work, is something that I can keep in the digital space, and we don't have to then follow up with all of that and have these long and in-depth conversations about criminology and peace building, and everything seems so serious, and it can seem quite challenging and down. But you take that same sort of set of interactions and relationships, and suddenly you have, you know, during this lockdown, I've probably become more involved in politics than I ever have done before, and that includes politics abroad. So I've been following with a lot of interest the events that have been going on over the summer in the United States, but I've been able to interact with people who are involved there in a way that just previously I was an observer, and now I can interact and I can take part in, to a limited extent, and certainly not to the same extent as people who are on the streets of Portland. But you can have conversations and dialogue with people in entirely different countries in a way that we just didn't used to be able to. So it's fascinating from that point of view. The relationships you can build and how you manage your existing relationships completely changed by digital.
Yeah. And I think in relation to, you know, forms of social justice, that for me, certainly for people in prison, and we talk, Mark, you began this by talking about Leicester as a community, and I very much believe that our local prison in Leicester is also part of our community, and yet these forms of deprivation can limit those transactions between community and our prisoners, and what's the impact on that? What messages is this sending to people who are already disenfranchised because they've committed crimes? But it comes back to those bigger questions about the purposes of community, but it's about digital citizenship, exactly what you're talking about, James, and sort of the proliferation of digital networks, and is to what extent are the, and this is what I was driving at towards the end of my presentation is, and I think what you were alluding to, Mark, about technology being neutral, or can it be neutral? Well, no, it can't, but it can be ethical.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because I was thinking during your presentation and subsequently, and this also applies to a lot of the things James said as well. It's kind of the silver lining in the prison system that they're opening up digital technology to have online visits. That only works if the people on the outside have access to the technology. Yeah. And you can imagine that a lot of people in the prison population probably find themselves stealing because they don't have things ordinary people have, hence they've stolen, as like broad generalization, but there seems to be a bit of a risk there that if you move in this direction, you're still excluding people on the outside, and subsequently excluding the person on the inside who wants to speak to that person on the outside. It's,
there's lots of tensions around that. There's a sort of that prisoners aren't a deserving group, but there's established wisdom that whilst you're in prison and you experience these deprivations, particularly about human contact, and I think there was a study done last year about illegal mobile phones being in prisons, that they get into prisons and prisoners use mobile. According to this report, most of prisoners were saying, I use it to ring my family at a time that suits them and me, and not when I'm unlocked from my cell. Plus, it's cheaper for me to rent a mobile phone than pay the pricing structure of the official phones in the prison. So there's also tensions around, exploiting prisoners and their families, who are also being punished due to those kinds of deprivations. And I think somebody made a comment earlier, I think it was Russell Webster, sent in a message about, the fact that are we going to get to a point where technology is going to replace human beings or reduce human contact even more? There's some lobbying groups in the US who are kind of against what they're calling video visits, which in itself it's not a visit, it's a call, but through video. And that's $25 a hit, to make that call to their loved one in prison, so that the family member has to bear that cost. And those debates around, certainly in America, the other states, the mass incarceration agenda, and certain groups are overrepresented that are typically the poorer sections of society. And so there's a fear that our prisons will move towards eliminating face-to-face visits, co-present visits, with a digital visit or a digital call. But that's where my point about developing an ethical approach to this, that should never happen if you take on board everybody's needs, including prisoners' families.
So before we move on to, we've got a couple of questions to explore, but I just wanted to wrap up the panel discussion by the comment James made about Marcus Rashford's excellent use of digital media or a blended approach to get his message across. What do you think young people could learn from that, James?
Oh, what can they learn? I think part of that is definitely that there's a power. There is this idea of digital technologies being a democratizing process, and giving a lot more power back to ordinary citizens. And there is some truth in that, but it still has to be used effectively and intelligently. And I think what Marcus Rashford's done is phenomenal in terms of both the partnership work that he did with FareShare, that he then leveraged into social media. And then it was at that last point when he needed to get the message right over the edge that he then utilized the tradition of the open letter. I think, for one thing, you can see the process laid out. He's obviously worked out what the process is. I'm sure he's worked with the team, and he's worked alongside FareShare all the way through this process. But they've worked out what their strategy is, and they've gone for it, and it's been very effective. I think if young people want to do similar, there are a number of lessons to be learnt now, in terms of how to try and get policy action, try and get things actually changed. It's probably the first one I can think of that's properly been organised and run through digital technology. We've seen public campaigns before, and we've seen famous people involved in public campaigns before, but they've really relied on traditional media or broadcast media. This idea of engaging people and creating a groundswell and getting a government to change its position on something primarily through digital media, this may well be a first. It'll be interesting to see how people take that up and then move forward with that kind of approach, and what we'll see next. I'm really excited to see how this gets replicated and utilized again. What they can learn, I think, modeling from Marcus Rashford is definitely a good starting point.
Thank you both. So now we've got a couple of questions to work through, and a nice one to get started, and I'll aim it straight at Victoria, because I think she's got a keenness to answer it. But has COVID-19 presented a new opportunity to access justice and for it to be transparent?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you an example. Here in the UK, we have the parole board that sits and reviews prison sentences, and that they're coming towards the end, and it's down to the parole board or that process to decide whether or not they're released. Traditionally, pre-COVID, this was done by bringing a group of professionals, both within the prison and outside the prison, to a table to hear the case. Quite a complex process to organise. There's a number of stakeholders involved, including the prisoner. That hearing's heard and a decision is made. What COVID has done has basically meant that those meetings couldn't take place, but the parole board couldn't afford to fall behind, because there are so many. So what COVID has done is kind of accelerated their appetite to draw on what technologies they can to kind of bring those meetings. So quite simply using conference calls on the telephone to undertake the reviews, send the paperwork through digitally, obviously securely, to the right people, and using video calls to have the hearings, that the prisoner is also present and can participate in their own hearing. What they found here in the UK is that they're getting through a hell of a lot more parole hearings than they did using the traditional co-present method. So in a sense, you know, in terms of customer satisfaction, including the public, because this is a decision that's made on behalf of the public as well, is that these hearings can actually happen much more quickly. We're seeing the same happening in our courts. That use of technology, even the basic telephone. Believe it or not, the criminal justice system hasn't been very good at even using the telephone. The snail mail, I think it was you, James, that was talking about that. So in a sense, I think that's a really good news story for both the prisoner, practitioners, the parole board, and the public, that that justice is being dealt with, and basically the wheels haven't stopped moving, and technology has been part of that. I'm not saying that, and then this is the feedback that I'm getting at the moment, is that these kinds of situations, you know, there are challenges. What about if certain stakeholders in that parole board, including the prisoner, have certain learning difficulties or language needs? All those things need addressing. But in the main, they're finding that you know, they're able to progress at a greater speed. The top line here for the public is the use of technology. It's reducing cost. If you think about bringing 10 or 12 people round one table to visit a prison, the cost of fuel, the impact that's having then on the environment, if you're not having to drive to get to somewhere, you know, there are lots of cost benefits to that. So it's a case of them gathering evidence and constantly reviewing. But I think COVID that's a silver lining within our justice system, that technology is being used to make sure justice is still working.
I agree with what you're saying there, Vic. My only concern is if at some point later on in the process somebody decides that means that they can ignore the campaigns, the very legitimate campaigns about bringing prisoners closer to their local community.
Yeah.
We do have quite a broad distribution of individuals in the criminal justice system right across the prison estate, and that can be hundreds of miles away from where their family and loved ones are. So my only concern, I've been to parole hearings and had to present as a probation officer there, and so having that more comfortable environment, everyone's a little bit more relaxed. The cost savings is phenomenal, but it's whether that then gets used as a justification later on to ignore campaigns that have very legitimate grievances about the way prisoners are distributed across the estate in the UK. And this ties into what you were saying about the US using video calls as if they're a visit, because they're not the same.
Absolutely, and there is that dark side, certainly within our justice. You know, we're all familiar with the RoboCop. On one of my slides, you might have seen like a dog-like image, and that's RoboGuard in Korea, South Korea, and this guard monitors prisoners, you know, to make sure that they're alive and kicking. It's doing observations through their cell doors. And you know, this model, I think, is an interesting metaphor, isn't it, of robot. Is the machine going to take over the human? And I think my argument comes back to, well, what are our moral drivers? Should technology be disrupting and reforming our current justice system that is ultra punitive? And that can we not manage crime and justice in better ways, and that technology should only be used as a nourishing and helpful aid?
I think that's going to be the key, and not just in terms of prison practice, but probation, the whole of the post-sentencing system, and policing as well, have to be thinking about how to adopt these practices in an ethical manner. And I think that's one of the most important things.
Yeah, it's so interesting and complex.
Got just a couple of minutes left, so obviously I'm going to bring in a big question about world peace, which could be resolved in seconds. But it follows on from your talk, James. Somebody is asking if you could say something about the negative versus positive effects of technology on world peace.
I think, from my point of view, I'm a digital criminologist. I'm absolutely pro the use of technology, and recognizing there are some caveats. From a world peace perspective, I think the evidence is actually really quite positive. Yes, there are risks from people in particular positions of power who might abuse their use of digital technology or utilize digital technology to further their abuse of power. I think I mentioned that during my talk. But I wouldn't say that their use of digital is the only way they're abusing power. That is just a part and parcel of their daily practices of abusing power. What I think I take from it is that it's not creating new conflicts, but it's letting us know about conflicts that are always going on. Mm. And raising that awareness is really vital. And once you start to raise awareness, you start to create opportunities to leverage people in power and create new opportunities to start building peace, to have narratives across different groups who might otherwise have not spoken. I recently did some work around policing and public accountability in the Brazilian favelas. And one of the really interesting things there was the Brazilian government had deployed a paramilitary team or unit to the favelas to institute quite draconian clearance programs where they would try and take out all of the gangs who were running a particular favela. But it was only when they started engaging with the local population through digital media who had had to sort of privately implement their own access to the internet. But once they'd got it, they were able to talk to the local government about, well, you're leaving a massive vacuum. And it's a temporary fix, and you're really not helping the situation. So they were able to raise this point with their local representatives. And there's now two teams that go through the favelas. They do a clearance with the same paramilitary team, and they're quite harsh. But there's a follow-on team who come in and will then help to rebuild a more pro-social community, trying to bring in services, trying to help people to identify where they can kind of reclaim spaces within their communities that traditionally might have been given over to organized crime. So I think at the local level and at the international level, you get this awareness raising followed by the ability to leverage action. And I think that is the real key and the real take home for me for digital technologies in peace building.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's 2 p.m, so I've been asked to wrap up. Our brilliant events team of Sandra and James behind the screen today are now working overtime. So I'd like to say thank you to them. Also, thank you to Dr. James Tangen and Dr. Victoria Knight for their excellent presentations. Also, everybody who's taken part in listening today and joining in the discussion, that's great. I did say I would mention that an organisation called Celebrate Our Similarities is holding an event later today. If Indrani or Kamala is still online, if you can post the details of that in the comments, I'm sure people will want to join your event later. But thank you for joining us on the International Day of Peace. I think that was a great way to emphasise the diversity of work that's going on at the university in relation to this field. It's a very big field, and we hope we've given you a really exciting snapshot. So thank you very much. Stay in touch, and do follow us on social media, and drop me an email if you want to pick up on any of the points raised today. Thank you.